Hey everybody, my name is David Litzer, and I'm an undergraduate here at the Chukasky Institute for Archaeology in the Ancient World at Brown University. Today I want to talk a little bit about my experience making ancient Roman bread. So I constructed ancient Roman bread recipes from primary sources with the help of secondary sources, and I worked very closely with a professional baker here in Providence, Rhode Island named Felice Romella. So the cool thing about ancient Roman bread is that the Romans had very similar tastes in bread as we do today. So it was pretty easy to go about constructing the recipes because Felice and I were able to use our knowledge of contemporary bread to see how we can make the bread that the Romans would have eaten. The hardest thing about ancient Roman bread, though, is that you couldn't just go out and buy yeast. And a lot of starter bread today is used by going out and buying yeast from a store. More serious bakers, however, use something called starter. And what starter is basically they had yeast from somewhere to begin with, but it's this dough, it's this core of dough that a baker can keep for a very long time, sometimes for days, sometimes for years. And they can have this with them, and that's just a thing of growing yeast. The problem is how do you initiate a starter without going out and buying yeast? So we had a few ideas. And the best one we had was from Pliny's Natural History. He said fermentation is made from the reduced bran of wheat and softened by unfermented white grape juice for 3 days, broken down and dried in the sun. Okay, so what does that mean? So basically what we thought is that the reduced bran of wheat that the Romans would have acquired from the fields might have had some traces of wild yeast on it. And therefore, if they let that sit for a long enough time in grape juice, we don't know if the grape juice actually did anything, but if it just sat around for a long enough time in the sun and dried, you would have a yeast culture starting to grow on it. So we went about recreating what we thought would be the most effective starter recipe based off that relied most closely on Pliny's description. So what we did is we started with 200 grams of wheat bran. Then we added 1 tablespoon of starter that Seven Stars Bakery here in Providence, Rhode Island, kindly gave us a sample of, because we knew that the wheat we would be getting, the wheat bran that we'd be getting here in Providence, would be processed and therefore be cleaned of any natural yeast that would have been growing on it. So therefore, we knew that this wouldn't change the taste that much. But unlike Pliny's recipe, if we followed it today, unlike Pliny's recipe back then, if we followed it today, there would be no yeast in it. So a recipe we know wouldn't work. So we knew we had to add a little bit of something that had yeast in it, just so that we can go through the steps of following his recipe, but so that we would be sure that it would work like as well as it did back then. Next step is that we added the 500 grams of organic white grape juice, which is basically unfermented white grapes, as Pliny told us to do, and we mixed that all up. And the result is that we covered it and let it sit for 3 days, and that was then what we used for a base for one of our starters, which we will get to in a second. That, however, was not the only way to make starter in the ancient world. We also used another description about Pliny, which described millet being broken down by unfermented grape juice, and how it's especially used for fermentation throughout the year. So just another allusion to another way to make a starter. So we tried to give this one a shot. So we took 200 grams of millet flour, which is just another type of grain. Took, again, 1 tablespoon of the Seven Stars Bakery starter that we'd used before, and for the same reasons, and 1 gram of organic grape juice, and we mixed that all up. And then we shaped that into a diamond, as was described in other sources that we came across. And we wondered, like, what is the use? What's diamond? That's so specific. But then when we actually started doing hands-on, and this is the cool thing about experimental archaeology, if you do it yourself, you understand why. We realized that by saying diamond, all they really meant was shaping it in your hands in the way that's imagined, so that you actually have a block of starter that you could store for a little while and then take out when you need it. And so we also let that one cover and sit for the 3 days. And you can see to the right the starter that we had made before. So what's the point of making starter if you're not going to do something with it? So uh, I want to go through how to make. We made two recipes that are very similar to each other, except we use different starters. So let's call them simple bread with bran, and then the simple bread with millet starter. I call it simple bread because a recipe that I'll make in a second is a little more complicated. It has a little more flourish to it, but the pictures here shown are of the two different recipes. I think they'll be labeled. Let me describe how we made them. So what we're going off is Cato's De Agricultura of the yeah. So he said, make kneaded bread thus. Wash your hands in mortar well. I love that. Wash your hands, and nothing's changed. Put the meal into the mortar, add water little by little, and work at it finely. When you've worked it well, form it and cook it under an earthen vessel. Okay, so using this, we took as much information as we could. We took the basics, but then we added. So this is why we call it simple, because we didn't want to go too far beyond what Cato says, but we knew that there are some steps that we had to take so that we would end up with a loaf of bread. So pictured here is the recipe with the millet starter, but again, as I said before, we're doing both these recipes with the two different starters side by side. So we start out with one of the starters, and then we mix 1,000 grams of bread flour and 4 grams of salt with starter. And salt, we'd seen in other stores that salt was pretty widely used. It was so widely used, in fact, that it would be easy just to leave it as an ingredient because Cato is more just giving a very, very broad overview. And also, you might notice that he didn't really give amounts of what to use. So we used our judgment as bread bakers today to think what would have been appropriate. So we mix more 7 Stars Bakery starter because just want to make sure that bread will indeed rise, because the ancients, the wheat they used would have, as I said before, had yeast on it. Our processed wheat today doesn't have wild yeast on it because it's been cleaned. So we add water, and then we knead it until all that stuff is mixed up. We let that rise for 15 minutes, and then we knead for about 2 more minutes. And of course, kneading is very fun. If you've never made bread before, I highly recommend it. Kneading is a very satisfying experience. So we cover that with plastic wrap and let that dough rise for 3 hours. So there's a lot of waiting when it comes to bread making. We shape the bread into a round loaf, and then we let that rise. And we had to let them rise for different amounts because the starters were different and the starters are made up of different things. So it took longer time for them to reach the same rise amount. So we made 4 bisecting cuts, which we've actually found loaves of bread from Pompeii that have been preserved, and we see that this is in fact how one way that the Romans made their bread. So we wanted to replicate that. So we bake the bread, and then we let the bread cool because we don't want to go head over heels eating it. We don't want to burn ourselves, and of course, someone else is very interested, as you can see on the left. And then pull apart along bisectors for easy serving, and it's really quite good bread, if I may say so myself. Okay, so another recipe we made was bread of the peaceful people with millet starter. Why do we call it that? Because Pliny gave another example of some bread. Said some work it from eggs and milk. Indeed, peaceful people even work it from butter, for the kinds of work of the baker with anxiety passing over. So basically, it says in peacetime you have more access to more expensive ingredients, so those can be used in bread also. So we wanted to go about making it also. So we just did the same thing as the 2 recipes we did before, or as the 1 recipe we did before, sorry, and we used the millet starter, except of these 3 differences. We used all-purpose flour instead of bread flour, just because we wanted it to be lighter, because that's probably how it would have tasted. Add 2 eggs and 1 stick of butter, as he says, and then only 1 slash along the 4 bisectors, because we thought that the extra liquid here would make the dough too unsturdy, so we didn't want to play with the dough more, and it was very tasty again. So with that result of that bread, we actually made French toast. Of course, they didn't call it French toast. That's just our equivalent to it. And what we get it from is from Apicius. Break smooth wheaten bread and make more small mouthfuls, pour it in milk, and fry them in olive oil, pour honey over it, and serve. So, followed as example, pull out the crust, break off bite-sized pieces, soak in milk, fry in olive oil, turn pieces over, and then we drizzled honey all over right before it was done. Put the pieces out on a paper towel to let them dry, and the Romans, they're so smart. They really got it right. French toast, I learned so much better. We can eat it in one bite. Another thing we did was cheese bread. And this is really the end result. It's a very, very easy thing to do, and that's based off this description here about bringing cheese in a mortar. And this is like a simple bread, a starter bread as we have today. It had no yeast. It was just kind of a quick thing. It tasted a lot more like a cheese Danish. Use goat cheese, flour, egg, salt, and then just put it on the parchment paper and mix it up, and then let cool and ready to eat. And it was really, really very good. Yeah, so I highly recommend making Roman bread, and you can follow this PowerPoint to do it yourself. It's very easy. Thank you very much.